Good afternoon to all. Many thanks for joining us. I am Hilde Blomme, the Deputy CEO of Accountancy Europe. Now, why do we hold this webinar today? So we first have to take a little walk down memory lane. Most of you will recall a few years ago at European Union level, it was decided to amend applicable regulation to have a new requirements for issuers of financial statements to prepare them using a single electronic reporting format starting from 2020 annual financial reports. So that was the introduction of the European Single Electronic Format, or Esef, to have both human and machine readable information. Now, as intended, users will make decisions based on digital financial information provided in the Esef compliant annual financial reporting. The European Commission also considered the need for audit to ensure their reliability. Some of you will recall our October 2020 Accountancy Europe webinar on Esef, which focused on opportunities, challenges, and practical considerations about Esef reporting and assurance. Our objective for today's webinar is indeed again to support national efforts and contribute to an efficient and effective Esef implementation. So why do we do this webinar now? Well, you might recall that there have been some delay granted in the application of Esef, and we know that actually 23 European Union member states have opted to delay the implementation of Esef, but 4 countries, Austria, the Czech Republic, Germany and Slovenia, decided not to delay the implementation. And therefore, we wanted in this Esef in Practice webinar share information of the experience in some of these member states, as we know there is a strong demand for this type of updates about Esef. So today, we share experience of first-time implementers with you, and our first session will be moderated by Catherine Shammerhorn, who is a partner with Grant Thornton International and is responsible for the development of service line methodology and learning. In this role, she established a working group made up of member firm leaders to discuss and share best practice related to providing assurance related to Esef. Catherine will be asking questions to experts from Germany, focusing on the success of their first year of Esef reporting and assurance. Now, before we start, some housekeeping. Please ask your questions at any time during the event by submitting your questions to Slido. The link to Slido is under your YouTube player, and it's also on the screen right now with the meeting code. If you go to www.slido #Esef. If you are watching on the Accountancy Europe website, the Slido Q&A is just to the left of the video. As far as the questions, we might not be able to answer every question that comes in from the chat, and we hope for your understanding on this point. But we hope that our speakers will actually already have responded to a lot of your questions in their remarks. So with that, Catherine, over to you.
Thanks, Hilde. First, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's session. As Hilde mentioned, in December of 2018, there was a standard issue where Esef was approved and was originally effective for January 1st, 2021. The purpose of Esef was to have an established single structured electronic format for the EU annual financial reports. And this format, as Hilde mentioned, provided one machine readable file that included the financial statements, management report, and the responsibility statement of the individuals responsible within the company. And one of the expectations of Esef is that it will enhance the comparability and usability of the financial information. In particular, investors will be able to have better and more comprehensive use of the data and the transparency of the EU statements. As Hilde mentioned, that was for some member states, they were deferred, but one of the firms that did not defer was Germany, and They started applying the SF requirement starting January 1st, 2021. And to share their experiences with us today are Holger Audit. Holger is a senior manager from the EY Professional Practice Group in Berlin, Germany. And one of his responsibilities is the coordination of all matters in context of assurance on SF. And he is also a member of the SF working group of the Institute of Public Auditors in Germany. Joining Holger is Thomas Küster. Thomas is the audit technical partner of PwC Germany based in Frankfurt. He is a member of the Auditing and Accounting Board of the Institute of Public Auditors in Germany and chairs the SF working group. So I want to thank both Holger and Thomas for joining us today. Let's get started. So as many of the participants today will just be implementing for the first time, as Hildy mentioned, a number of member states chose to defer a year. Let's start with some overall thoughts on the first season. So Thomas, let me start with you. And what was your impression of the first season?
Yeah, good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for the nice introductory word, Catherine and Hilde. You asked for the first season. I think we survived. And putting it in much nicer words, I think the first season went pretty well. In the end, the vast majority, I think I better need to say all of the companies actually prepared their SF documents, and the SF documents have been audited by the statutory auditor as intended. So from that perspective, everything went well, and we have not envisaged serious time delays. So in submitting the financial statements and in submitting the SF documents. So from that perspective, that was a good season, and with all the obstacles, I think we actually have proved that it is working, that it can be done. So I would say a very positive feedback in general. However, I think what helped us, first of all, we had a clear legal framework. So we had German legislation in place mid of summer. This helped us a lot. Plus we had the auditing standard of the German Institute, which actually gave the blueprints, the guidance to the companies and to the auditors. So with that in mind, we are really, really happy with the first season.
Thank you, Thomas. Now, Holger, from your perspective, what were some of the most challenging issues in the context of the first year of the SF audit?
Yeah, hi, Catherine, and good afternoon, everybody. Definitely, for the SF audit, from my perspective, there were several issues that really can be called challenging. I think very important was the timing issue in context of assurance on SF documents. And with timing, I really mean two aspects. Firstly, we consider timing to be very important in context of getting ready for SF audit. This included the setup of audit work program based on the developed audit standard and to prepare and educate the audit teams. This also included the selection and actually the development of audit tools. So in general, this covered all the enablement for initial audit, and timing was very important because there was obviously a limited time frame available to prepare ourselves. The second aspect on timing relates to the integration of ESEF audit into the existing audit procedures. Therefore, it requires a very good understanding when you can perform audit procedures and what kind of documents must be available when. So this is really important. Beside timing, I think another issue proved to be challenging for preparers and auditors was the application of the ESEF regulation for marking up the information on consolidated financial statements. So challenging, especially because of the absence of detailed guidance in the ESEF RTS and other ESEF literature. Just want to give you two examples. I recall a discussion about how to mark up restatements in the statement of change in equity and how to mark up the period start amounts in this statement. And we also had a very long discussion about the interpretation of narrow and wider elements in context of anchoring and in general about the allocation of taxonomy elements. And in some cases, we concluded there are alternative approaches eligible, and therefore also I think it's important to have a consistent approach in this kind of context. I think another challenging issue belongs to the quality of software that was used by Prepare to create the ESEF documents. At least from my perspective, in a substantial number of cases, software vendors had to fix their software and preparers had to implement those software updates. The situation has definitely improved over time, and I really don't expect these issues don't be issues in the next season. Nonetheless, I think this issue is still, let's say, to be required to consider in your planning for the next season when planning the audit strategy. And in context of challenging issue, I think it's also worth to mention to have an issue with the submission of ESEF documents to the official appointed mechanism by companies. This was an issue we did not have on our radar initially because the submission to official appointed mechanism by companies takes place after the audit. However, it became an issue to us because for several reasons from a technical perspective, many clients could not really submit the ESEF documents. For example, the official appointed mechanism introduced some last-minute changes in addition to the ESEF requirements. And then we had some situations where client had to adjust the ESEF documents, and then it became an issue for the auditor because you need to discuss with the client how to deal with those changes. So that's definitely something you also need to have on your radar because it also impacts any kind of audit consideration. And I think there are really several other issues that are worth to mention, but I think that would go too long. But definitely the issues that I mentioned is really considered to be necessary when preparing for ESEF audit, that you have an answer on those issues.
Thanks, Holger. Now that we have some of the overall impressions, Thomas mentioned that overall he felt that it was a success. So let's now talk about what some of the keys to that success are. So Thomas, you mentioned the clarity about the legal framework as a success factor. Why is that? Isn't the directive the basis for all member states, or is it different by member state?
Yeah, in theory, you're absolutely right. The directive should be the basis for all member states and should actually make sure that all member states have an aligned process. However, and put that from an auditor's perspective, we look at the details, and the details and the implementation in each of the territory is actually different, because the EU directive actually needs to be transposed into local law. So from that perspective, it was really for us the question: what is the German legislator doing with that? And in the end, let's say we had a clear, what I would call legal framework. So we had a law enacted by 1st of July last year, 6 months ahead to that January deadline, December 31st deadline, where the German legislator really clearly stated what his, let's say, what's the process is going to be. And in the end, the German legislator actually decided to go for a two-document approach, which means that the financial statements, let's say, needs to be prepared as they always are in order to be approved. So the financial statements need to be prepared, and then another document. This is why we always refer in the German environment to the Esef document. Then the financial statements needs to be transposed into the Esef documents, which are used only for filing purposes. So for all the legal aspects within the company, the financial statements, which you actually know from for the last probably 50 years, the financial statements need to be compiled and need to be prepared as they always did. And after that, the Esef documents need to be created. And both needs to be audited by the auditor, and which was the issue, and Holger also referred to the timing challenges which we actually had, needs to be audited at the same time. And as you can imagine, let's say the company were not really willing to move the deadlines to a later date. So it all needs to be done at the same time. But as I said, let's say we had that clear message, that clear law in place 6 months ahead to December 31st. So this helped us really to understand what it actually means. And therefore, if I may add that, there was no discussion in any place, and nobody, even if we had that discussion, I must admit, but nobody really waited for the delay, even once we heard it, because we knew that another process actually needs to be started to rechange the law again in that respect. But those who are a little bit familiar with the subject actually didn't consider it to be a realistic option in the German environment. So therefore, we had clarity. The companies knew what to do. We knew what to do, and this process was not disturbed by any discussions in that respect.
Thanks, Thomas. Holger, you mentioned that timing as a challenging issue in context of the SF audit. Can you provide some examples of how this was addressed?
Sure, definitely. Firstly, I think, and it's obvious, that you need to plan the ESEF audit and setting up the audit strategy. And in this context, I think it's very important to start timely and also have as soon as possible discussion with your clients how to approach the ESEF audit. Ideally, the auditor would move audit procedures considered to be necessary to a very early stage. As Thomas mentioned, you're running out of time when you really would like to address all these kind of necessary audit procedures at a very late stage. So, for example, it turned out to be very helpful if companies provided dummy financial statements in ESEF based on last year actuals at a very early stage, because this would allow to test the technical validity of ESEF documents and also the test of mapping on the elements and also the test of anchoring of taxonomy elements at a very early stage. So this is really important that you encourage your client should really provide a kind of dummy financial statement in ESEF at a very early stage so that you can actually already start on this document. In addition, I think it's also important to consider the year-end timelines and determine whether the time from the prior years is still possible or needs adjustments in context of the new ESEF audit requirements. So in other words, the agreement with client on time on deliverables is very important. And also want to give you here an example. If the company uses service providers, so external service providers to prepare ESEF documents, it is important to consider some extra time buffers just in case there are material ESEF errors. So then, therefore, the ESEF or the service provider would need to create another ESEF document, and this obviously takes time. And this is really something you need to consider in your timeline. Also, therefore, you should also plan for extra rounds. And in the same, let's say, in the same aspect, in the same context, it needs discussion with clients how to deal with last-minute changes for financial statements itself. Because whenever you're changing now something, could be even a minor part in the ESEF documents, it might require a new validation, so a new kind of audit round. So therefore, you should also, at a very early stage, discuss with your clients how to deal with last-minute changes, because this is obviously something that could be tricky in context of ESEF audit. So with these steps, we approached our clients at a very early stage and discussed those timing issues. And I think this is very helpful if you want to really succeed with your audit on ESEF.
Thanks, Holger. I think there are some key takeaways there that others can learn from on how to actually do a cost-effective and efficient SF audit with respect to timing. Now, Thomas, let me go back to the auditing standard you mentioned. Why was that standard key?
Quick answer is because this was the only compendium which we actually had with respect to ESEF preparation and ESEF audit. So we were able really to issue the first draft of the standard mid of September. And this was very well received, first of all, by the profession, the auditors who actually reached out to the clients and discussed with them what's the timeline, like Holger mentioned, what actually needs to be done in order to prepare the financial statements. But it also helped really to emphasize what are the areas the auditors are looking at during the audit. So even if an auditing standard is generally designed and written for auditors, I think it was read and considered much more by the client than by the auditors themselves, because this was really the first compendium which we actually had. Plus, and if I may add to that with respect to the auditing standard, we had various discussion in what I would call the Esef community. So it was not only that the auditing standard of the German Institute was published, but we also had a discussion group of the German accounting standard setting committee, and we had discussion group of XBRL Germany. And within this discussion group, we had all in basically participating. The preparers, the software vendors, and the auditors. And we use this as an exchange of information. We use this as an exchange platform on what is best practice, how to approach certain issues, topics. And this really helps a lot to assure that we all had the same understanding what the preparation of the Esef documents and the audit document and the audit of the Esef document really means. And we had a very intensive information exchange.
Thanks, Thomas. Holger, from your experience, do you think that there are common pitfalls or misunderstanding in context of SF? And if so, what would you recommend for planning the audit of SF documents?
Yeah, I think that's a question very close to the answer that Thomas just gave. I think there were several types of misunderstanding, mainly because, or the main reason I think it was that it was not always clear how inline XBRL as the underlying technique for Esef really works from a technical perspective. And also from my perspective, from my personal perspective, the technical specification for inline XBRL and all the other sub-specifications are very lengthy and complex. And as Thomas mentioned, we had a very good knowledge exchange in Germany, having discussion groups, and this really helped. And internally, of course, we transformed this kind of discussion and knowledge exchange, and we found it very useful to form a kind of expert team. We trained the expert team that had the kind of in-depth knowledge on Esef, about all the technical specification that really can actually the expert team can support and the audit teams to perform the necessary audit procedures. And furthermore, the expert teams were also a kind of, let's say, column to make sure that the audit application or the audit procedures and the application of Esef was really applied consistently. So therefore, really, I think an expert team that really has all the kind of knowledge that's very important. And you mentioned pitfalls. Well, as a typical example for a pitfall, I would refer to the sign logic of markup amounts in Esef. In our audits, I think the most common error by preparers was the incorrect sign of the markup amounts. And this is also due to the way how Esef is really marking up the sign amount. And that's not very trivial to understand. And therefore, from my perspective, it is really very important to have necessary knowledge about how Esef works. And we address this with an expert team within our house. And I think also others did the same thing, that you actually really form an expert team that is trained with all the kind of detailed special knowledge about Esef.
Thanks, Holger. Now that we've talked about the initial experience in the first year, Thomas, can you share your overall impression about the last season? You've shared that. So what are your expectations for this next season and then maybe beyond this next season?
I really believe that next season will go even smoother than this year, than this season actually did when it did go. First of all, I think I expect a process improvement at the preparer side, at the clients. They actually know what to do. They actually have the systems up and running. They know what kind of software they're using. So from that perspective, I expect a much smoother process from that perspective. Plus, the auditor and the auditors and the specialized group in the audit firms, as Holger mentioned, they knew what to do. They know, they call it the responsible parties. They know whom to talk about. So from that perspective, I expect that this will be a much smoother process going forward. Plus, and this is the other side Holger mentioned, the software used, A, by the client and B, by the service provider, was not always in that shape which we expected. So there was a lot of bug fixing during the process. And now with year 2, we expect that these bug fixing will be more or less over, so that we have, let's say, software in place at both sides, at the clients and the service provider, which run without major problems. Certainly, and again, in practice, it was always the auditor who did something wrong. But what we found is that the process of submitting the Esef documents to the OIM and that interface and that portal was not in that shape as we expected it to be. So also a lot of bug fixing with respect to that. And now we do have, at least we believe we do have a portal in place which actually works. The process are defined. So we expect that the submission process to the OIM is also going much smoother. So put it in other words, so I expect that it will be a standard process for FY21. And last but not least, you mentioned beyond. I consider that to be, as I would say, as a blueprint for the non-financial reporting, which is required for FY23 for all of the companies. So from that perspective, the non-financial reporting in Esef will probably follow the same processes. So I think we all can benefit from the experience now with the financial, with the pure financial reporting.
Thanks, Thomas. Holger, do you like to add anything?
First of all, I think I would actually echo what Thomas mentioned. So definitely, also I would share this view. Perhaps from my side, I think one of the also change, or let's say improvements for next season is that's personally I expect also some enhancements on the Esef core taxonomy. I mentioned let's say before that, for example, we had discussion with how to mark up restatements in the statement of change in equity. When we're looking now to the latest IFRS taxonomy, we see now actually some improvements. So now some additional elements have been added, and so we're looking forward that those let's say improvements are also moved into the Esef core taxonomy, so that we actually then have really a more clear guidance how to do and how to mark up, or the preparers have a clear guidance how to mark up, and also from our perspective to give assurance whether this is appropriate or not. So therefore, definitely, I think also we expect some improvements and enhancements on the taxonomy itself, so that actually the client does not really have to develop all these kind of extensions to extend the taxonomy. So definitely that's something I would also expect for the next season.
Thanks, Holger. So I have one final question. As I mentioned in the introduction, Esef was introduced to be more than just a compliance exercise. The thought was that when it was introduced that it would enhance the comparability, usability of the financial information. Do you believe that this is going to be the case? Thomas, let me start with you.
Good question. Thanks, Catherine. Let's be quite frank. let's say we have IFRS as the accounting standard, and in theory, IFRS financial statements should be comparable. And they are comparable. However, we see different line items, different implementation of standards by different companies. And what we just have seen in this season, that the current set of called financial statements were transposed into Esef as they are. So no changes actually have been made to the underlying financial statements, because that presentation was considered by the companies for a long time to be appropriate. And just because of Esef, no one of the preparers actually did change their presentation of the financial statements. So from that perspective, in year one and probably in the next years, I do not expect that in terms of comparability, it will actually move closer to each other. In a long run, probably always, if you have a taxonomy, if you have a framework, there's a tendency to use that taxonomy and to use that framework. So I do believe it will have a positive impact in the long run, but in the short run, not at all. I furthermore did mention the non-financial reporting, where taxonomy is actually is currently being prepared. With respect to the non-financial reporting, knowing quite well that we have no experience yet, but I expect, because companies and preparers start from scratch, they use the taxonomy as basically as developed. So from that perspective, if the taxonomy is first, then a huge consistency can be expected. At least this is my view on that.
Thanks, Thomas. Holger, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think, once again, I share the view from Thomas. And I think from a usability perspective, as we mentioned before, the software vendors still have to implement and update and fix the software. And I think it is too early to say whether now, let's say, also users of financial statements have appropriate software that they can use it. And I think that's the kind of chicken and egg problem, what's there first. And it's my view that definitely there will be some kind of software vendors now developing also tools on how to consume actually the electronic data. So I think for the first season, I think it's too early to say whether the usability of financial information has improved, because for the very first time we have now, let's say, machine readable data. And I think that's something where also software vendors will now start to develop those tools. So I think at the moment it's still too early.
Thanks, Holger. As you can tell from the messages from Holger and Thomas, there's a lot we can all learn from the experience in Germany. Some of the key takeaways I took from their comments is start preparing your clients now. This is not something that you should wait on. And you need to make sure that there is a clear understanding of who is responsible for various things, what's management responsibility, the service provider, and of course, what are the auditor's responsibilities. And also get a clear understanding of the timing. As Holger mentioned, you need to plan the SF audit. It is not something that can be left to the last minute that you do just before you have to file the financial statements. And another key point that was made was have the clients do a trial run with appropriate software, as every small change requires a new validation. So again, really get started early in the audit process. Another key message was to establish a center of excellence within the firm. So this is a complex subject matter. So you need to form expert groups to do the work and really start training and educating those experts now on what is necessary to do an SF audit. Finally, wherever possible, work with the regulators to establish the member firm standards. As we heard, one of the reasons that Germany was successful is that the group developing the standards used existing literature and development of the standard. Many jurisdictions on this session are in the process of establishing a standard, So it's important to work with the regulator as much as possible to be part of the process in the development of the standard. So I'm just going to run through the questions. We've got some questions that have come through, and get Holger and Thomas's thoughts. So one question, and this is Holger, you might have some thoughts on this. What can be done for a cost-effective and efficient audit of SF?
Yeah, obviously, I think that needs to be addressed when you're developing your work program. But I just want to give you an example. So if you plan your audit strategy that you really do not focus on the internal controls by the client, but you really check the ESEF compliance directly with the ESEF documents, what was, I think, the common approach in the first year, then definitely from an efficient perspective, you need to consider what kind of errors I can find automatically with software, and what other errors that cannot be really detected by software on an automatic basis. So what kind of report I need to have available that I can actually check whether the markup is compliant. So therefore, you really need to check first, the order of checks you perform. For example, if you can already, in the first step, make sure that the document is technically valid, then you can actually perform the markup validation. But you should not start with the markup validation if the document is technically incorrect. So therefore, you can actually straight send this to the client, because I think it's necessary to have a technically valid document. So therefore, you need to consider what kind of errors or possible errors can be detected automatically by software, and what kind of errors really can't be detected by software. And you need to have then additional reports, and how to structure those reports with, let's say, audit tools that you can actually perform very efficient and effective the audit.
Thanks, Holger. Thomas, a question for you. The German audit standard, was it linked to the ISAs, and how was the conclusion reported in the auditor's report? And a follow-up to that question is, how did you guys make that work, considering that the standard was marked draft?
Let me start with the first question. So first of all, what was the requirement actually to do an audit of the financial statements and the SF documents at the same time? So they all went into the same auditor's report. However, we had the report on the financial statements plus a separate report on the SF document. The audit of the separate SF documents was done in accordance with ISA E3000, and we mentioned that in our report. So from that perspective, we have basically that overall report, the auditor's report required by German law, and then we have one section, a report on the audit of the financial statements, and a second report on the audit of the SF documents. And as I mentioned, the SF documents were audited in accordance with ISA E3000. So not ISAs, because an ISA audit actually is an audit which should give a true and fair view in the end. I know that's not completely technically correct, but you know what I mean. It's basically a view on the financial statements, versus the ISA E3000 engagement was basically that the audited financial statements had been transposed into the SF documents as they should be. So what was the second part of your question? Sorry, I didn't make notes.
So the second part of the question was that the standard was draft. So how were you able to make it work?
Yeah, so that's a due process. So there was not enough time. We issued the draft standard beginning of September. As I mentioned, the law was enacted July 1st. So the standard based on the concrete legal requirements was issued beginning of September. So that's a draft standard. And currently we are in the process really to issue the final standard. However, in practice, it didn't make a huge difference if we had the draft standard or the final standard, because that was the only standard available. and the standard was, from my perspective, prepared in such a manner that it could be used by everybody. So because of the due process, because of the timing, we had no other chance. However, it worked.
Thanks, Thomas. I think in looking at the questions, we've addressed the other questions that are in the chat. So I want to thank Thomas and Holger for their time today, and I'm going to pass it on to Hildy to introduce the next session.
Thank you very much, Catherine, Holger, and Thomas, and your contributions were really very interesting, at least for me, and I hope our few hundred viewers, both on YouTube and directly on our website, we're almost having 300 people there, have found it as interesting as I did found it, and I hope it will help you in your endeavors as far as Esef are concerned. We have a second session for you, and our second session will be moderated by John Roden. John Roden is the iXBRL service leader at PwC in the UK, and he will be asking some questions to experts from 3 countries this time, from France, from the Netherlands, and from Spain. They were not early implementers, I would say, but he would like to focus on their experience so far and how they are planning for their first year of Esef reporting and assurance. John, over to you.
Well, thank you, Hilde, and just delighted to be here today. Amazing numbers for the audience, and thoroughly enjoyed and learnt from the first session. So let's try and build on that. And the first thing I'd like to do is introduce our panelists. And firstly, Alicia, Salvador, Vega. Alicia joined Deloitte in '99 in the audit area. And from 2006 to 2007 was seconded to Deloitte's London office. Currently, she is continuing her professional career in the Spanish firm's technical department. Alicia is actively involved in the development of audit regulations, and in particular during the last year in a Spanish regulation to international auditing standards and the application of Esef technical auditing standards. Alicia is involved in various working groups and is a member of the Spanish Institute of Certified Public Accountants, where she represents Accountancy Europe Esef Audit Task Force, and so is connected in that way. So welcome, Alicia. And secondly, I'd like to introduce Antoine Robert. Antoine Robert is a partner in audit and assurance at Deloitte Paris. On Esef, he's specifically involved in the mapping side, and we'll be hearing more about that from Antoine, so that tags can be validated and extensions used by issuers are appropriate. He's a member of the Deloitte Paris Esef group, and he helps audit teams in that role. And our third, last but not least, panelist is Ronald van Langen. Ronald is the SBR XBRL leader within KPMG's firm in the Netherlands. He's a financial auditor, an IT auditor with a focus on matters where audit and IT connect with each other. He's also the chairman of the Esef working group within KPMG and a member of the SBR Assurance and Esef working group of MBA, which is the Dutch Auditors Institute. Ronald is a member of the expert group for the Dutch Taxonomy for Financial Reporting, a member of the IFRS Taxonomy Consultation Group, and a member of the Esef Task Force for Accountancy Europe. A lot of hats there, Ronald. So we have a really well qualified panel. So let's, if we may, get started. And I'm going to begin by just saying that people are wondering just how similar or different is the implementation of Esef turning out to be across Europe. So I'd like to invite the panelists to outline how Esef is being implemented in your country, its status in the law, the extent of voluntary filings, the role of the auditor, guidance that's available, those sort of things, and essentially an overview of what's happening in your country. First up, could I ask Alicia, what's happening in Spain, please?
First of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have the chance to be in this event. And thank you very much, John, for your kindly presentation. In Spain, I will say that we are at some point, lucky, as we at least have already clear guidance on all this subject matter. It is true that at the end of the previous year, there were still a lot of doubts and uncertainties regarding the possibility or not to defer, and on the application of the Esef requirements at an entity level on a voluntary basis or not, depending on such deferral, and on the auditors' obligations. It was not until February the 12th when our Spanish regulator, the Audit and Accounting Institute, announced that there was indeed a possibility to defer. The problem is that by that date, some entities had already published their annual report under the Esef requirements, and the remaining entities had already spent a lot of time and made a significant investments in material and human resources, and they were not willing to waste that investment. Let's keep in mind that in Spain, February the 28th is a key deadline for the listed entities. If they submit their annual report at the latest of that date, they avoid having to publish financial information for the second half of the year. So many entities take advantage of that possibility and issue their annual report no later than February 28th. From the experience in our firm, more than 80% of the entities chose to submit their annual financial report according to Esef requirements, even considering the deferral option, and mainly because of I have just mentioned before in terms of resources already spent. On the other hand, the Audit and Accounting Institute issued on those same dates, and in particular in February the 9th, a technical auditing standard on Esef requirements that has allowed the profession to have a clear understanding on the obligations and requirements from an auditor's perspective on this regard. Requirements in relation to planning, materiality, types of opinion, written statements, or other requirements are considered in such a technical standard. It requires the auditor's conclusion on Esef requirements to be included in a separate section in the audit report. The general understanding, and I concur, is that the annual report is unique. The annual accounts are what they are. Regulation has only changed the way in which they are presented, the format. Where previously they used to be on a paper, now they are presented on a file. And even our stock exchange regulator made a communication on this regard more than a year ago in April 2020. So to conclude, in Spain, we can say that having finally been voluntary, the vast majority of entities chose not to defer and publish their annual financial reports in accordance with the Esef requirements. And on the other hand, from the auditor's side, the technical audit standard issued has allowed the profession to have a clear guidance through this process.
Alicia, thank you. It's fascinating that people decided to continue despite the option to delay, and you've got already a significant body of filings. I'm wondering if that's the same in France. So let me bring in Antoine. Antoine, what's happening in France?
Yes, thanks, John. And first of all, hi everyone. Very happy to discuss with you. So in France, the situation was the same, with the decision to postpone the Esef filing at the end of December 2019. But a few months ago, or a few weeks ago, it will be already in mind of all the issuers that they can postpone if they want. So the number of issuers who have filed on the Esef format was very limited for the year-end 2020, I think it's something like 75 issuer. I don't know really the number of issuer, but maybe like 500 or 600. So it's a very limited amount of issuer who have a file on SF format. So we can say that 2021 will be very challenging for auditor, for issuer, and for IT provider for sure. Regarding the law, we have a professional practice standard which defines the work that the auditor has to be performed. I can mention three steps. One's understanding the process of preparation of financial statement under ESF format. Second step, review of 100% of the mapping, meaning completeness and accuracy of the mapping. And third, review of consolidated and statutory financial statement. We have to check that these financial statements are prepared under XHTML format, and that obviously these financial statements are the same that financial statement audited by auditors. We are lucky as auditor because we have also a guidance published by our national company of auditors, so named CNCC in France, with a lot of explanation of what are the explanation. Sorry. On issuer side, we have also a lot of toolkit, if I can say that. For example, on the IMF website, we have specific guidance in order to help the issuer, and also IMF accepts that issuer prepared some dry run, and that this dry run will be checked by IMF. Maybe one point very important for the issuer, meaning that the work performed by IMF and by the auditor on the ESEF files are not the same. So we have some cases on which IMF say, okay, I agree with your ESEF file, and us as auditor we say no, we have some warning or some fatal error and so and so. So we have some discussion with the IT provider and with the issuer. And so for conclude about that, because we have a lot of new issuer in 2022, so in the next 6 months, we have to prepare and we have to explain to the issuer that everything should be performed in advance. And I think we will discuss that later during this conversation, but it's a very, very important point.
Thank you, Antoine, and you know, fascinating. Germany, Spain, France, each have separate, I guess, national language auditing standards, and you've really given a picture there of the different facets and activities that the auditor is required to be involved with. Thank you. Let's move to Ronald. How do things stand in the Netherlands, please, Ronald?
Thank you, John. Well, in the Netherlands, it's more or less the same as in France. In the Netherlands, the filing in SF was voluntarily, and that means that around 18 filers have filed in SF out of the 150, so about 12%. And if filed in compliance with the RTS on SF, that was being audited. The result of the audit was reflected in the paragraph report on other legal and regulatory requirements, because SF was a statutory requirement, and we came to the conclusion the best way to support the user of the financial report is to provide an opinion not only on the true and fair view, but also along whether it is in compliance with the RTS, and put it together. That was done based on a paragraph, ISO 700 paragraph 43, where it was about legal and regulatory requirements. The text of the auditor's report is included in the inline XBRL file, so it's just one document, including the auditor's report. And for the SF audit, the NVA, the Dutch Institute of Chartered Accountants, issued an audit alert. It was in draft, then it became final just at the end, on the 31st of December last year, but it was there and it helped us. But what more important was that it was helped us. The NBA also created an technical audit guide, and that was also it was drafted, but also being used by 2 software vendors, and make sure and update it, upgrade it. And that means that at least we, from the technical side, needs to know what to do and had the software in place to perform such kind of audit.
Thank you, and you make a really important point. Not everything needs to be a rule or a standard. The role of guidance that doesn't quite have the authoritative power, but is just so useful for preparers, software companies, and auditors to be able to refer to keep them on the right track, has a key role to play.
Absolutely.
Really interesting to see. Let me just give a short update on what's happening in the UK. And the first thing to say is that Brexit does not affect the implementation of ESEF in the UK. It actually came into the FCA, our National Competent Authorities rule book, before Brexit. ESEF is referred to specifically in the Brexit Withdrawal Act of Parliament. You know, it's now sort of baked in as UK regulation. So we're doing it. We did have a delay in the UK for a year. Clearly, that was driven by the problems and challenges of the pandemic. But in it, the FCA described ESEF as potentially a significant call on the resources of issuers. And I think their words were quite prophetic. As I've listened to all of what's been said, I think that sort of call on the resources of issuers to get things ready is fairly significant. We don't have an audit mandate here. It's a matter of UK law as to whether ESEF is covered by the true and fair opinion as defined by UK law, and it is not. That was clarified in December. And I suspect that will be looked at again in the future, because there's currently a review of corporate reporting going on, and so that may not always be the case. But at the moment, we don't have an audit mandate. What we do have is an updated national storage mechanism, able to receive and make available publicly the ESEF files. And on the 17th of February, the very first one arrived on the National Storage Mechanism. It was British American Tobacco PLC, and we now have 25 published ESEF files in the UK, and anyone can go search National Storage Mechanism FCA, and you'll find it, and it's all on the front page and easy to search. So we're making progress. We've made further progress in terms of the taxonomy. The FRC has taken the ESMA's ESEF taxonomy and added some things actually to do with streamlined energy and carbon reporting primarily, to enable issuers to be able to tag that element of their annual report if they so choose. No mandate at this stage, but the people are interested in that information. They're interested in it digitally. So we're making some good strides forward here. But 2021 annual report is going to be a big year for us, and there is plenty to do to get ready. So I hope that gives people a sense of 4 different countries and where they are on their journey to 2021 mandatory implementation. I'm going to move now to our next question. And this is about getting ready. So for many, the option to delay ESEF has pushed the requirement back so that it begins for 2021. For issuers and auditors now getting ready, what should they be focusing on between now and the end of the year? What preparation works best? And we're going to start with Antoine and your perspectives, please.
Yes, so as we said, and I think everyone agree with that, we have to be prepared before year end. And obviously, because it's a new format, maybe XBRL, NZF, and so are not very familiar for everyone. We have to work on dry run, and I think Ronald will talk about that. In my mind, in order to be prepared for the filing and in order to make a dry run before year end, we have, our issuer and auditor have to work on the mapping. Because it's not a very straightforward exercise. The taxonomy is very extended. I think the last one is more than 1,000 pages, so it's not so easy. Obviously, we can work on mapping even if the IT tool is not chosen. and even if the 2021 financial statement is not prepared, because we can work on 2020 figures. I think the layout of the primary financial statement will be pretty the same between 2020 and 2021. So what I have experienced last year, and we have worked with issuer on the Excel spreadsheet with the primary financial statement on a column and the appropriate tag or extension with anchoring, and we can discuss about that. But I think we are all familiar with that right now. So if we can audit, as the auditor, I'm auditor, the accuracy and the completeness of the mapping on the 2020 figures in order to prepare a dry run and work on it before year end, and we will discuss later this point, it's a very good exercise, and it will be very, very, very helpful for the filing at the beginning of 2022.
Thank you. That's extremely illuminating, and I wonder if Ronald, can you take that further and talk through dry runs and other?
Yes, I will do. Thank you. Antoine was talking about dry runs, and I think dry run needs to be done in. You can see it in two aspects. One is dry run, the technical, the file, really the technical validity of that, because we have identified a number of issues. I've seen initial filings in draft with 200 validation issues. So it is, and that's most common are really the mandatory items, how to deal with it. Are they included? Are they hidden? How should they include it? Duplicate labels, because the label in the financial statements is not exactly right as it was in the IFRS standards. What should we do with that? Is this an issue? Yes or no? Negative items, debit and credit. Holger already mentioned it. In the previous session, it was something to be aware of, and a dry run will help to identify that. And then the accuracy and the completeness of the calculation link-based, often forgotten, but it is about, okay, and it helps because then it also shows where it does match, and it shows also the debit and the credits again. And if we do a technical validation, you come up to issues about, well, my software vendor didn't find anything. No, but we know all the software has to be upgraded, updated. It was really a learning experience in the last year, and we know that different software result in different results. And also, if they done a test filing at the local OEM, yeah, maybe the local OEM did not have that extensive validations as we have used ourselves. So there are differences, and you have to overcome and discuss. The second part of the dry run is about the process. We talked a little bit already about late changes, and it's a little bit hard to do a dry run, but be aware of what you do, what you need to do about last minute changes and how that will affect the process. But in order to start a dry run, it is about being aware that Esef is applicable and be getting ready. I had discussions with teams and with filers that they still started to select a vendor. Luckily, it was postponed in last year, but it was about, okay, a little bit too late, and not all software vendors had the capacity, especially last year. But I'm a bit worried also about next year. Do they have the capacity, the resources to facilitate all these issuers in January, March timeframe? Because that will be quite challenging as well.
Thank you, and I suspect you've got our audience worried now, Ronald. I think we need to sort of focus a little bit on where do they start and the skills, and I'd like to bring in Alicia. What are your thoughts?
If I had to highlight one of the aspects at this point, and in particular in relation to the human resources, I will highlight there is a need for both issuers and auditors to have multidisciplinary teams. Not only financial or audit skills are needed on the side of the entities or the auditors respectively, but technological versus financial or audit technical ones are also needed. Many times communications between the service provider of the client that has probably a minimum or no knowledge of auditing, and the client's team or the auditor's team involved in the process with technological skills in this regard that sometimes are not or could not be fully developed, have not been always easy. Most of the questions during the process are not related with the tagging itself, but with some other technological issues. And in many times from the client side, the client team had to ask or to contact its service provider. From the auditor side, the auditor team had to contact their consultant colleagues or even their own service provider. So, and even when some technological issues arose, the way to solve them were not always identical, dealt in the three types of validations. Because remember that we have three types of validations during the process. First, the one on the customer service provider. Second, the auditor tool. And finally, the regulators one. So for that reason, I believe skills more than the tagging ones must be developed by the teams involved in the Esef process, both from the client's perspective and from the auditor's one. And this will lead in a more value-added Esef reporting process.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, three very interesting perspectives on getting ready there. I'll just add in one other thought, if I may, and that is about culture. I have always been struck by how listed companies take their annual report and take exceptional pride in every page, every paragraph, every word of that report. And the attention to detail can be absolutely phenomenal, and you know, evenings spent turning pages to make sure things are absolutely perfect, because it is the document that really puts the best foot forward for a company to the external world and their shareholders. I think the secret to success with Esef is to squarely land it within that culture of excellence in annual reporting. If you treat it as something different to be dealt with on the side, maybe we're going to outsource as much as we can to someone else and it's not really part of our culture, I think that's a recipe for problems down the line. But if you take that culture of excellence that exists for listed company annual reports and apply it to the challenges that you've heard about for Esef, I don't think you'll go too far wrong. And I'm hopeful in saying that. So let's move on. And we've talked about getting ready before the year end. I want to now turn to that last final push to get Esef done, because everything we've heard suggests that the final weeks and days before the Esef annual report is finalized are an intense period for everyone involved. What should issuers and their auditors expect? What are the key challenges, and how were they solved with the clients you worked with that have already done this? And we're going to start with Ronald on this one, please.
That's a good one. It really comes to, have you been prepared as auditor, but also as issuer? Because if you have done the dry run, if you have sorted out the validation issues, sure, that last minute, the final stage of the financial reporting process will be challenging. And last minute changes are not always that easy, but then you know what to do and what to expect. And then the Esef can add its value or show its value as well, because adding numbers may reveal some validation issues about, okay, you have now a duplicate because you changed it in the primary financial statements, but not in the notes if that has been tagged, or it doesn't reconcile anymore because the calculation is wrong. That kind of things will help. So Esef may add some additional value to it. But yes, if you haven't done your dry run, if you start a little bit too late, relying solely on your service provider that needs another 2 or 3 days, that could be challenging. I know that some filers in the Netherlands were pretty good prepared. They did do the dry runs, but even they didn't file in Esef. And one of the reasons was, of course, the challenges they faced in the last period. So mind you, if there is no possibility to do it otherwise, and SF needs to be prepared, make sure that your year-end process is as straightforward as it should be.
Thank you. That is fascinating, and I think what you're sort of suggesting at here, Ronald, is that as people reflect on the right tags, they may also reflect on the right words to describe a line item in the financial statements, and whether they make change or not. You know, that second sight of are we explaining this as clearly as possible is a route to added value. Okay. Let's get Alicia's thoughts, please.
Okay, the Spanish technical standard that we have mentioned before does not give an answer on how to manage the final phase of in the process in terms of identification of the files reviewed, insertion, or better said, not insertion of the boards of director signatures on the annual accounts that, at least in Spain, is a requirement, and the insertion of the signed auditor's report or even other expert reports that can be included in the annual financial report. So the document that has to be presented under the XHTML format is the annual financial report that includes, among others, the signed auditor's report. The fact is that from a technological perspective, the XHTML format does not support electronic signature. And hence, the audit profession had to work together on a solution. And the Institute, which I represent in this group as one of our corporations, issued some guidelines to solve that technological problems. The guidelines were developed with the objective to clearly identify which one were the files audited, and that have made us experts in obtaining hash codes, as this is the way we consider most appropriate to identify the files. Later, the insertion of the auditor's report has to be considered to be inserted as an image format, and it was also appropriate considered by our stock exchange regulator. The fact is that such insertion obviously changes the hash code or the file, as it is in some way a sort of manipulation of the file. So it is not the original one, and we have to check the change. So our work at this point is to check that the only difference between the original one and the one with the signed auditor's report is only the signed auditor's report. I mean, there are no other changes, for example, on tagging. And obviously, this process takes more time than the process the entities and the auditors could expect on previous years. So, and hence is a key aspect that entities must take into account in their financial close and reporting process. And lastly, in relation to the expectations you mentioned, I personally expect with any kind of doubt is the consolidation of the process. Like everything, I think experience is a key point, and issues have suffered uncertainty in many aspects throughout the process, and they have learned a number of lessons that they are going to improve their 2021 audit and filing process.
Thank you, and a really helpful, I think, reminder that just the practical issues around signing the file and how you do that in digital context need to be thought through probably a little bit before those final days to make for that sort of smart execution at the end. Antoine, you must have seen a lot of projects go through in a short space of time in France. What's your best advice?
Yeah, yes, I fully agree with all the information mentioned by Ronald or Alicia. So obviously it's a key challenge, and build a real project management organization is key. Please keep in mind that a lack of preparation before year-end will increase dramatically, maybe, the risk regarding the filing process. And we have faced this problem last year with many frustration with our clients. So build a roadmap with key deadline, responsibilities, role of parties between issuer, IT provider, auditors, and so is very important. Please have in mind also that you have to maybe have some buffer, because we have always bad surprise regarding dry run. The example regarding the negative amount or calculation rules and so is very important, and we can work on the dry run and resolve all the negative amount issues and calculation for 2020, and because the amount is in the opposite way for 2021, it's not the same rules. So you have to build your financial communication calendar with these issues, and work on a daily basis, maybe not, but on a weekly basis with all the parties to be sure that you will avoid a lot of surprise and to have a filing as smooth as possible. The first year is always a negative experience, but it's the life of a new project, so it will be easier in going forward, but work on it right now.
What wise words, and I can't give great insight on what happened with Esef and Audit. It just simply hasn't happened in the UK yet, but I'm old enough to have been involved in the implementation of IXBRL for company tax returns, which was 10 years ago now. And that first year was a big challenge. There is no doubt about it. We had a lot of work to do on behalf of preparers. And the one thing I will just say to give people a bit of hope, it is capture and bottle the learnings, because year 2 and onwards should not be nearly as challenging. Things do smooth out, and these days with that particular piece of regulation, it rarely crops up in sort of discussions about what's causing issues or difficulties. It is very well bedded down 10 years in. So there we go. Okay, that's all we had for the prepared questions, but we do have a bit of time, I think, before handing back for some of the questions that come through on Slido. And so we're going to try and do these in a sort of fairly quick fire way. First one, point of clarification, really. Did companies ask for a voluntary audit or was it actually mandatory? If the company decided to do Esef a year early, was it mandatory for the auditor to do it? Who would like to start on that one?
I can start.
Okay. Ronald.
In the Netherlands, we came to the conclusion in our working group at the Dutch Auditors Institute that if we prepare an auditor's report on an Esef filing, and it provides a true and fair view, but the user may use also the technical layer, the tagging, he should be able to rely on it. So for us, it was no question that should be audited. It's not, it didn't feel right, let me say that, as it was about not to include an opinion on the Esef. That put us probably in more risk than not to. So on a legal basis, you may argue, is it legally required? Because Esef was not legally required, but we came to the conclusion is if Esef is being filed, we will do the audit. Okay, so it clearly thought of as the stand-up thing to do in the Netherlands. In Spain, Alicia?
It is not usually on a voluntary basis, apart from the issues that are really obliged. The fact that they decided voluntarily, it was because of the delay and the deferral option that I mentioned at the beginning of the panel. So for that reason, most of the entities made voluntarily, but in that sense. So, and yes, it's for the auditors, it's mandatory to conclude on that voluntary basis, even if, for example, an entity decided during this 2020 year to mark not only the principal financial statements, but also the notes that they were not mandatory, the audit had to conclude on the voluntary tagging of the notes, for example.
Yeah, so the companies had an option to defer, but the auditors did not. So if the company did it.
Yes.
And Antoine in France?
It's clearly the same.
Okay, perfect. Let's move on to another question that's come through. What do you think will be the main use and benefits of Esef? And who would like to go first on that one?
Me, for example.
Please do.
I think is the way we are moving now. So digitalization, and not only on the financial information, but also in the non-financial information that we are going to live in the following years. So I think it's critical. So I think it's the way and what we have to do. So digitalize, machine read. So I think it's the future. So we have no option to not take this trend.
And any other perspectives on that one?
Well, it will create a huge set of data, structured data, that allows for new ideas on how to use it. So I believe it adds up to transparency. But it takes time. The first year we don't have all the filers available in Esef, and it will take time to create a database. But now, I already see the benefits as about, okay, how is another company is doing their tagging, and it is so easy to compare the taggings from one company to another. So that really helps. It helps us also in the audit.
Yeah, I think it will be easier also for investor to use a set of data as they do in US with Edgar. So for me, it's clear for that.
Yeah, and just to build on that, someone told me that these days, when Edgar is interrogated for company information, the majority of interrogations are not a person looking for an annual report, 10K or 20F or whatever the document is. It's a machine asking for the data. That is the majority of downloads, and of course that sounds a little bit impersonal. Actually, all of those machines have been asked by a person to do that. Machines are dumb, and there are good reasons for it. People want aggregated data, and I'm sure this is going to be used because the information annual reports has always been used, and those uses don't go away because of Esef. Okay, I think we've got time for perhaps just one more before handing back to Hilda. This plays to this point about the human element. What type of errors can't be identified by a tool or a machine? Why do you need the auditor, the person, to look at what's going on? And can you give a flavour of that? And who would like to go on that one?
Maybe I can start if you want. I think because auditor performs the audit without Esef or XHTML format, and also because board will approve, if I can say that, the financial statement with a Word or PDF format, we have to compare these two elements. Is the first step. And I think there is some mistake that a machine, or right now at this stage, cannot identify, like the issues regarding the negative amount. I think for a cash flow statement, without a review, a human review by auditor, we will face many errors.
Ronald, you look like you might want to.
Yeah, well, no, that's true. The true thing is the technical part of the Esef file, yes, we need to have a computer to do that, because I don't want to have an auditor reviewing manually whether it's in compliance with the XBRL specifications. No, that's impossible to do. But the tagging is to be done manually, because sure, you may, or there are some tools I've seen that try to use artificial intelligence, text recognition, but even then it is hard whether they have selected the appropriate tagging. So the appropriate tagging exercise is something we need to do manually, and judgment comes into place into that. And especially if extensions are being created, is that really needed, and is the anchoring accurate? That is something we do manually and using our professional judgment.
And Alicia?
Just to add that I completely agree, Ronald, and it's in line with the multidisciplinary teams I mentioned earlier. So tagging itself is not going to be detected by the machine, and other technological issues are not going to be detected by the audit professionals. So we need both skills.
Well, I agree with all of those perspectives, and that really just leaves me to say thank you to the great insights from the panelists today. Really appreciated. I know hundreds of people are watching this live, and many more will see it on the playback. So really appreciate the work you put into sharing that. And with that, Hilda's back on the screen. Hilda, over to you.
Thank you very much, John, as well as to Alicia, Antoine, and Ronald. Really much appreciated, and a wealth of information for the people that are indeed in huge numbers still on our webinar. Now we have a Slido poll that we actually would like you to go through. It's a live poll, so if on Slido you could click on that, and what we would like to actually ask you is, what specific aspects of Esef would you like us to cover if we would run a future event on this topic? So if you answer directly to Slido, we will look at that, because indeed we are considering that there might be interest and also a need to do a further Esef event in the autumn of this year, before the first year implementation will really start off. If you don't have time to answer just now, then we will leave it open for a day or two, so you can actually come back to it and answer to that afterwards. Before we close, I actually would like to answer to one question that came from the audience, and the question was, what does Accountants Europe plan to do to help the profession? So one of the things we are doing is, what we did today, and also potentially another event in the autumn. But if you would go to our website on www.accountancyeurope.eu, and you just in the question mode, you type in Esef, you will see a number of entries, and I would like to ask your attention for just two specific ones. One is from the 25th of January 2021, and it's called Esef, the Collected Guidance, and there you have a short overview of basically, I would say, the history of Esef, but with a lot of links to relevant information on reporting, on auditing, and on other matters. And in that, you would also find a link to as something that we did, and on which we actually spent quite some work from the 19th of December 2019, and that's called Individual Assurance on Esef, and together with the Esef task force within Accountants Europe, everybody who was on this panel today is a member of this. That is actually guidance on independent assurance on Esef that could form a basis for an audit standard in your country, or for you as an auditor to actually preparing for auditing Esef filings. So hopefully that will be useful to you, and I hope that today you had a lot of what I would call key takeaways, lessons learned that actually will help you to get started on implementation, because we have learned preparation is key. Thinking about timing is also key. You need to build up expertise. You need to educate your teams, and so we hope with what we discussed today that will help you to get you on the way, and we hope that we will be able to come back to you on Esef, and maybe not only on financial reporting anymore, but potentially also looking forward on what digitalization of sustainability reporting will mean and how Esef could play a role with that. On that note, thank you very much for all involved. Thank you for all our participants, and have a good evening. Thank you very much. Bye from Brussels.